And
Welcome to Nothing Exempt. I am Nick Pardini. I'm here with my regular co-host Brian Piotr, plus two special guests. We had Jack Mulcair coming back after appearing on episodes 45 and 46, and we also have Dr. Harald Malmgren, who Jack will give a more formal introduction to. Um, Before we start that, I'd just like to mention that the show is brought to you by the Cause and Effect Report. If you want to know more, go to causeandeffectreport.com. Now, Jack, let's make the introduction to Dr. Malmgren.
Sure. I've been following Dr. Malmgren for years on Twitter because he's one of the best sources of insight out there on issues of geopolitics and economics. He's been an advisor to four presidents on both the foreign policy and kind of international trade policy. And he's the founder and leader of the Malmgren Group, which provides advisory services to all kinds of major financial institutions and sovereign wealth funds. And generally, he's a guy who's been around the block. He knows all kinds of policy debates, both on kind of foreign policy and security, as well as economics and trade. You know, he knows that stuff inside and out. And I thought that there'd be nobody better for us to, have a chat with on a wide range of issues.
Okay, so our first question for Harold is that what do you think about the trade situation right now, and how do you think the trade negotiations will play out with China and the European Union?
Well, President Trump has no knowledge or experience in this area, but he has a feeling that the U.S. has suffered for quite a few years on jobs being running away from the U.S. and going to places like China. And he thinks he wants to reverse that flow. Now, what he doesn't know is that job outsourcing probably ended 15 years ago because the wages in China rose to U.S. levels if you take into account productivity. And so nobody sends jobs to China anymore. That's history. But he's unaware. His base is still with him on thinking that somehow we have to stop the bleeding of jobs. So he's opened up a number of threats to limit imports from China, put a heavy tariff on, but he hasn't been clear about his objectives. It is hurting China. They're not clear what they need to do to satisfy him, because the feeling in China is that he's doing some political theater first. He's trying to impress everybody in the U.S. that he's attacking the problem. So there is a confusion. But what is beginning to turn into is a serious confrontation. And in the last couple of days, the White House people speaking about it have started talking about the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping. Up till now, it has not been a Trump personal confrontation with Xi, but it just turned into that. And that is not going to go well, because leaders at that level can't give in to each other. They can't be shown to be capitulating. So when you start tagging the other leader, essentially everybody's position hardens. So at the moment, this China clash about some specific trade issues hasn't escalated yet, but it looks like it's going that direction. Now, how does it affect America is we put on tariffs on some goods that we sell, that the Chinese sell to us, and they turn around and say, okay, we'll put tariffs on goods you send to us. We picked manufactured goods, picked products like agricultural products, soybean, sorghum, which is animal feed crop, pork, pig meat, which is the biggest source of protein in China, and other such things. And so we're hurting them in the manufacturers area. They're hurting America's countryside, the farmers and the people who are in processing food and packaging and sending it abroad. So it's a clash of different cultures, and at the moment, it doesn't look like it's going to be resolved easily. May escalate. The problem is that China, if you pick a fight with its leader, it may end up in more than trade issues. It may end up with spilling out into national security issues, relations between the U.S. military and the Chinese military, how North Korea works out, because the Chinese are almost in full control of North Korea. A lot of the press don't see that, but that is the truth. So it's easy for China just to tell Kim Jong-un, you can be a little difficult now because the U.S. is getting feisty with us. Let's see if they want to handle that problem all over. So that's where we are. And now with Europe, it's a little different. If I can just take a minute with you, said he wanted to put high tariffs on German cars. You know, he used to live in Manhattan, and he sees all these expensive Mercedes-Benz and Audis and you know, the high-end vehicles, and he thought basically this would start a dialogue. I think what happened is he didn't realize that those German companies are already producing cars inside the U.S. in places like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, just like Toyota makes a lot of cars in the U.S. So for the Germans, they really don't care. They'll drop tariff. They'll be happy to drop tariffs into Europe to zero because they don't think American cars are attractive in Europe because they use too much fuel and they're too big for the roads. But what they can do is increase production in the U.S. That's good for America, sort of. But what it means is new factories, new production, new jobs for German companies in the U.S. But it means those jobs will be in the South. No help to Detroit. In fact, it probably kills Detroit. So it's a mixed picture.
Harald.
It's like, yeah.
So since you were talking a lot about China and about how the trade confrontation between the U.S. and China risks developing into a kind of personal confrontation between Xi Jinping and Trump himself, one thing I wanted to get into is how do you see Xi Jinping's kind of, I guess, rule in China? I know that he's been trying to reform China's kind of opaque and difficult to manage economy. And it's hard from the outside to get a read on whether or not those reforms have been successful. So I'd like to first hear your opinion about Xi Jinping personally as a leader, his style, and kind of the success of his signature initiatives. And overall, like, what's the level of risk in China right now? You know, people are constantly saying, "Oh, China's always on the verge of some kind of banking crisis because of their shadow banking and all these kinds of things." So I'd like to know what your opinion is on that.
Well, there's no doubt that there are huge problems inside China because China has grown really fast, but the growth has been propelled by borrowing money. Their debt level, government and private debt is, we worry about U.S. debt, but they're at a debt level 3 to 4 times higher compared to GDP and the size of the population. They're the extreme borrowing case. So, of course, they're going to have to somehow or other work out how to wind down that debt. And when you wind down debt, you either somehow take down the wealth of the wealthy, or you take down the income of the poor, or you divide it in some way. In some sense, we face that in the U.S. And if and when we have the next crisis, we'll have to think through who gets hit.
Somehow I think that I
So
know what the answer to that one will be, but anyway, go ahead.
yeah, well, the last time was we saved the banks and the bankers, and basically loaded the hit on all the homeowners. Um, I myself feel that was a mistake. That we should have basically banks to allow the homeowners to write down part of that debt, since they were selling them a lot of fraudulent products, and we should have let the bank executives and the shareholders, the bondholders, take a hit, partial hit at least. But we didn't. We let them all off, so they walked away much wealthier, and the rest of the nation much poorer. So she has to think through how to do this. Now, who is he? This is a man who has gradually built his power over 25, 30 years. And he's done it in a way hard to compare in any other country. He's not a Putin. He's not somebody who shoots all his enemies. He's not that kind of bully at all. What he has done is he's had a right-hand man who slowly worked through every powerful family in China, one by one, to see those opposed to him. Well, they were accused of corruption, and basically their wealth was taken, and they basically went back to normal every life. In other words, they lost all their power. Those who were mixed, they were put. Those who, well, of course, they were allowed to continue prospering, and so methodically he went through and tried to kill off the worst cases of grinding away at the population and getting wealthy. Now, he did the same with the military. The Chinese military at the senior levels, once you get high enough, usually you get a piece of the business around you. You know, if you're in the logistics department, lo and behold, you're buying and selling equipment, trucks, and all kinds of vehicles, and so you get in that business on the side. So the generals were pretty broadly corrupt. The worst were the generals in charge of the ports, where ships come, drop cargo in and take cargo out. Well, all over the world, ports are probably the most corrupt places. Used to be really bad in the U.S. It's less so now, but I won't say it's clean. What he did was basically, one by one, took out the generals who had dirty hands and replaced them with, not the second level or the third level, replaced them with somebody further down the line who had no dream to get high command so early in their careers and had clean hands. And so he basically, all the generals and admirals are they were given a gift of a career that way ahead of their expectations. And so they're loyal to Xi. Now, it's a way of governing. It's not the U.S. way, but essentially he gained so much power that eventually he was named leader for life. And in that role, he not only is in charge of the politics of the country, but he has a separate hat. He's called Supreme Military Commander. And for him, these are two different jobs. So nobody is really ready to go up against him. There are, it's like in any country with that big a population. We have to remember it's 1.3 billion people. It's quite a few times bigger than the whole of the U.S. So I'm sure there are people who are rivals or would-be rivals, but they don't get to organize because the Chinese system of monitoring activity is pretty thorough. Everybody in China is now in a facial recognition system. And I mean everybody, including babies. Every human being in China is on a biometric facial recognition system. And if people gather together, 10 or 20 people to talk about anything, it's noted. And if they meet often, that's noted. And eventually somebody will come around and say, well, why do you meet? Are you playing bridge or chess or pool, or are you talking politics? it's very hard to organize against a leader like that. But I repeat, he's not like Putin. He doesn't kill his enemies. He just takes their money away if they're troublesome. So in a sense, it's a less oligarch-oriented, take care of a few rich kind of system. Now, with all that work getting to the top of that many people, this man must have huge determination, a kind of relentlessness, but highly focused. And he has repeated the things that were said by Deng Xiaoping, who was the second leader, I guess, in China. Deng Xiaoping used to say it's not good for China to have conflict with the United States. We should not think about it. We should not even consider it as plausible, because the way the world works, if America prospers, China prospers. And the two of us can lead the world economy. So it's sort of a G2 idea that Deng Xiaoping had. Xi Jinping believes in that and wants to pursue that, but Trump right now wants to nail down these trade issues. And it is creating a significant problem. Once they started talking about Xi Jinping being an obstacle, I mean, it leaped from a trade level to a confrontation kind of issue. So I'm not sure the White House realizes they tripped across a no-go wire, that you can solve things without insulting the leader. So I'm more concerned about where it goes from here, because the man at the top can't be seen to be bullied by another leader. So he's going to do things that are painful to the U.S. in order to keep equilibrium and keep his own position. That's my way of explaining the Chinese leader.
That leads me to the next question I have related to China, is that given the fact that the trade deficit with the United States of China is so big, and China can really only hit U.S. imports via agriculture in a meaningful way, it seems like, based on what's happening with the valuation of the currency and what's going on with their banking interbank rates and the Chinese stock market, that the Chinese are being, at least perceived by the markets, hurt more by this trade war at this time being. At what point is China either going to buckle and cave in, or try to use means beyond counter tariffs to fight back?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting question, because they haven't shown, let's say, the next level of reaction. They have started making statements. Xi Jinping said something a couple of days ago that, he's not the kind of person he's not like Trump. He's not going to hit somebody directly with words like, if you do that, I'll do this. It's not, he lets people under him do that. What he said is, when a man lifts a boulder so large he cannot hold it for long above him, he is almost sure to crush his feet when it falls. That kind of thing, you sort of scratch your head and say, what does that mean? I think he's saying Trump is trying too much and this will not go well. It's a kind of threat, but it's so that's the kind of way of warning. Don't push me further, because I'll have to really hit back. Now, so how far this goes, I don't know. I don't think the Chinese military wants to fight with the U.S., and I don't think our military wants any kind of a confrontation physically with the Chinese. And indeed, if you'll see in the next 2 or 3 days, the Chinese defense minister and the number one PLA Chinese military admiral are coming to meet with Defense Secretary Mattis and a couple of our other generals and admirals. And that it made news today on the internet. And I thought, well, that's not really new. For the last 12 months, the two militaries have been meeting each other quietly. a lot of what they've been discussing is how to avoid accidents. Don't fly so closely to my planes. Let's make sure our ships don't bump into each other. Let's keep the air pathways known to each other so that there's no accident. And are there areas we can cooperate? And I think they talked a lot together about North Korea, because China doesn't want North Korea getting so troublesome in the world. The U.S. wants to tamp down North Korea. And the militaries of both our countries have, in fact, been discussing long before Trump got to it, long before Pompeo got into it, have been discussing ways to force North Korea to tamp down the pressure, to tamp down the provocations. So I think by the time Trump got into this, the scene was set, but it was set by the militaries across the Pacific of wanting to avoid armed conflict and avoid disruptive behavior by the neighbors. So a lot is going on that we don't see. Fortunately, we have people in our military who are totally committed to the concept of deterrence. Let's not go to war. Let's just be in a position so nobody wants to have war with us. And it's been working rather successfully, I feel, particularly under General Mattis, who's now Secretary of Defense. I happen to know him. He's a Marine, and like any Marines you've ever met who rose to the top, there's no nonsense. If he comes to a meeting, he doesn't shoot the breeze and say, "How was your kids?" and "How was the day? Did you play golf?" Like normal humans, he basically sits down and say, "Why did you want to talk? And what are we going to do today?" He's all business, but he's totally impressive. Everybody in Congress has confidence in him. Doesn't tangle with him because you meet him once, you realize. So fortunately, we have stability at that level. But now that we're challenging Xi politically in terms of his power structure, that's more ominous. I'm not sure where it leads.
Okay, I've really enjoyed this conversation about China. But this is Brian, by the way. Pleasure meeting you, Harold.
Hi, Brian.
Ever since I found out you were coming on the show, I've had a question that I've wanted to ask, and that was when you were a slightly younger man, you got to experience events that were before my time, and I was wondering if you had an opinion on the time in our country where we went from losing a president to getting LBJ in the White House and starting a war with Vietnam. What was it like at the time to go through that? And what opinion do you think that event had on our country as a whole? And if JFK hadn't been shot, do you think the U.S. would be in a totally different place today, and would we have gone into Vietnam?
Well, that's a really good question, but actually, I came to Washington at the very early stage of that. In the summer of 1962, I was an academic, and then I was called in. There were about a couple of dozen young economists who had made a mark here and there, who were asked to join McNamara in the Pentagon. And they were known, that group was known as the Whiz Kids. And I was teaching that year, but then McGeorge Bundy, who was the Jack Kennedy's national security advisor, called me. He had been dean of Harvard College. I had known him from my student days because I was I don't know how you'd call it. I mean, I was a kid who grew up from a working class family, but I had a really good academic record and I was a good athlete. So a lot of the universities were chasing me to go there. So I got to know people like George Bundy, and he said, "We need you to down here, but we don't want you to be in the Pentagon fully. We want you to be the link between the NSC and McNamara and his staff. So a pretty exciting job. I was very young, but of course, in the middle of that for a while, for more than 2 years, you get to know how these decisions are made and who was responsible for what. So I have to say, to start with, it was JFK who started us down the road in Vietnam. And behind him, history hasn't really written the story correctly. The prime promoter of a hard military stance in Vietnam was Dean Rusk, the state. Now, he got off without much pressure from historians, but the reality was he had been a hardliner on Russia and the spread of communism long before he came to the administration under John Kennedy. So he pushed pretty hard, and there were a handful of other hawks. I don't think McNamara really wanted to go to war, but he did what he had to do. He was ordered to, step up the war, but he didn't start it. We were already fighting. And it went very far, and I think eventually McNamara regretted it because it turned out to be a terrible mess in terms of a lot of people's lives lost and no good solution. And as for the economy, what happened was Kennedy, of course, died prematurely. Johnson took over, didn't know what to do with this war, except that Dean Rusk and actually George Bundy in the White House kept pushing him to keep going. You have to step it up. And then, of course, our military in those days thought, war is good. It's good for activity. We had a less mature military at that time because they had not been the ones who went through World War II. They were the betweeners who thought, I'm getting bored with golf. Maybe a little war is fun. So it became a real problem for the economy because we spent too much money, and the debt kept growing. So basically, America became trapped in this hellhole of debt accumulation, caught in a war that had no good end. It demoralized a lot of people. And so one of the things that happened is all those bright young minds that would have gone to public service instead ended up going to Wall Street to make money, to a whole different kind of career. And that was the process that began in the late 70s and went all the way through to the great crisis of 2008, when financial engineering became a Damocles sword for our market economy. Now, in that process, also, the post-World War II period was a huge positive period for the American economy because you had all these men coming back from war who were trained to get things done, who understood hierarchy and teamwork, and they all went to industry and rebuilt industry. And in the 60s and 70s, early 80s, American industry really prospered with all this talent that came from the war and had learned to work together. They weren't an army of rivals. They were an army that was aiming for the same purposes. Now, slowly died out. And then we had more and more financial problems that arose out of the end of the 80s and early 90s. The people who rose to the top of industry were the chief financial officers. Why? Because they were trying to cut costs. So we stopped innovating. We didn't have that drive. And then gradually, governments became focused on re-election. Now, the transformation that I think everybody overlooks, the biggest thing was in the 70s. And indeed, between two times I served presidents, I worked with the Senate. And I was a bipartisan person. It's out of fashion these days, but I was known as the person. When Nixon asked me, "Are you a Republican or a Democrat?" I said yes. And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I'm a problem solver. I'm not here to preach or to push an ideology, but the only way I think you can solve problems in Washington is by teamwork. And you got to cross lines and find people who have common interests. And then you have to, like a garden, you have to really tend to it so that it grows where you want it to grow." Anyway, during that time, TV people wanted to have entrance to everything that goes on in Congress. And eventually they covered every meeting, every committee meeting, subcommittee meeting. And what happened was politicians stopped talking to each other. They even stopped listening to each other. Instead, they were talking on the TV to their constituents. And from then onwards, gradually, everybody in politics became polarized because they were busy with re-election and rarely with how do we do something together. So up to the most problems, regardless of party, got resolved by meetings in the basement of the Capitol building. There's a bunch of cubby holes down there, and senior members of Congress usually got assigned one after a number of years. And you go down there, and people would sit down, have a drink, come up with a solution, and then the next day pass it to the staff and say, "Do this." But they were busy essentially putting on a show for the parties, but behind the scenes, we're busy trying to do something positive for the country. Now that's pretty much died out. Now, if people in both parties start talking to each other, they're accused of betrayal or treason or who knows what else. So we've lost that sense of teamwork, and that has resulted slowly, gradually in the rise of personalities over substance. So, each leader, Bill Clinton particularly, Obama, now Trump, are emphasizing themselves more than they are emphasizing national issues. So we're kind of in a downslide, and I think it's going to continue for a while longer. But I see gradually people beginning to understand this is where we're going and thinking this can't go on this way. So you're getting a lot of, let's say, younger people in both parties trying to rethink, well, what is their party? What is a Democrat? What is a Republican? So it's a transition period we're going through. But I see it personally because I'm getting older, but I get a lot of people in both parties who invite me to dinner saying, "Walk us through this," just as I'm talking now. Well, how did we get here? What's the way out? I mean, I sense all over the place this desire to get past this confrontation, highly personalized leadership, and get back to, we all have shared responsibilities. President has his job, we have our job. I think that's being recognized. So I have hope for the next few years. But for the time being, we're locked in. If you ask anybody what is the Republican Party, they'll say we don't know, but we do know there is a Trump Party, and that's in charge right now. And neither party is able to come up with really ideas of their own, so they just clash. Each side criticizing the other, but no new leader with who says let's put aside the differences, let's see what we can do together. That will come, but we haven't seen.
That leads me to the next question. There's some old rivalries. My question is, even with the Cold War ending 25
Nick, you're
years...
echoing a little bit. Can you fix your audio, then re-ask the question?
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
All right. With the Cold War being over for 25 plus years, almost 30 now, there's still a lot of animosity on both sides between the U.S. and Russia, even though they're geopolitically on other sides of the world. And in a normal environment, if there wasn't like an ideological communism capitalism battle, shouldn't be natural enemies. Why do you think that this continues? Is it just old Cold War rivalries that are in both militaries and governments, or is there some other reason that we don't know about?
it's a good question, but to answer it, you have to kind of look deeper into the structure of American politics during that transition, during the process of Cold War, collapse of Russia, collapse of the Soviet Union, I should say. And that process involved interest groups all over. Let's just take Poland. You asked me where was the political power of places like Chicago or Madison, Wisconsin, or you can name a few cities, and I would say, okay, it's union. And they'd say, well, what drives them? I said, well, you got to remember the key people are Polish. They're kids born of people who ran away from the Russians. And so they're impregnated with this hate Russia thing that is there underlying, but you don't see it in the day-to-day. But, and I remember Johnson saying, don't get in a sing match with a skunk. Try to identify where everybody is and what they are and make sure they're not a skunk if you're going to have a quarrel. But pay attention to the Poles and pay attention to the Lithuanians and the Romanians, because they tend to live in clusters around the country and they have huge influence in their communities. So a lot of the drive of the Cold War was not about just communism in broad terms. It was about, we hate Russians because they killed Grandpa and they pushed us out and Dad had to flee under gunfire, that kind of thing. So that was a large part of the pressure in politics in America. Now, we're past that. We're into several generations later. But still, there are a lot of connections between these communities and their relatives in Europe is still in fear of Russia. And now, is there a reason for that? And the answer is, well, Putin is making it clear all the time by the various military exercises he carried out, is thinking and planning for the day when he can take back a lot of that territory. So why are the Norwegians and the Finns and the Swedes and the Danes worried? Well, over the last 2 summers, all the major exercises of Russia were basically aimed at taking land away from particularly the Swedish islands, which are quite big, taking the Baltic states and pulling them back into the Soviet Union. You can say it's just theater, but when warplanes and ships are deployed and a lot of people deployed to do these exercises, it scares these people in that area. And so there's a lot of pushback through families and history to the U.S. So Putin knows he's being provocative. It makes him popular inside Russia. And a lot of people in Congress have to deal with these nationalist interests that spill over into their voting districts. So it's the Russian threat. I don't think Russia is going to attack anybody, but Putin thrives on looking like he's doing, creating fear. And of course, he is busy trying to interfere in non-military means through election influence, not just in the U.S., but he's spent a lot of money promoting nationalism in places like France, Italy. He's basically trying to get into the internal politics of Europe. He eagerly would like to split Europe into parts so that Europe is more easily brought into friendship with Russia. It's his nature. Now, as a boy, he grew up in St. Petersburg, which was on the border of Estonia. And personally, I met him in 1990, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I was on the same U.S.-Russia commission with him 2 years. I must have had dinner. He must have sat next to me at dinner at least a half dozen times. he has in his mind the importance of restoring Russia to its greatness, and his vision is wants to reach back and grab more of.
No, it's okay. We can finish up, and we'll kind of do our conclusion, just ourselves.
Yeah, you can patch it up. Mm-hmm. But anyway, in his mind, boiled down, our system of lawyers meeting to settle disputes, he said that takes many hours. The lawyers earn by the hour. They have no incentive to finish. In Russia, we do it the old way. Both sides meet. Both sides come to the table with guns. There is always a solution before the dinner is over. I said, that's really the system of the czars. He said, yeah, and even before the czars. It's the Russian way. I think he said it several times. Less expensive than the New York attorneys fighting with each other and avoiding to end the case because they like to bill the hours. So he's that kind of leader, and he likes the military, and he promotes the military, and he spends a lot of money on keeping his military happy.
Yes. They've spent about hundreds of billions of dollars on rearmament in the last few years, with decent success.
By the way, I want to add one thing that any American audience needs to know. Besides the military under Putin, there are about a dozen private armies, which are made up of mercenaries. And each of them, like with the old Roman armies, each of them is owned by one of the oligarchs. And a lot of the fighting that goes on in Syria is by private armies. So when the Defense Department, General Mattis cleared attacking Russians 2 months ago in Syria, you notice Putin didn't make a fuss, and that was because these were mercenaries. And the general of all the armies in Russia, General Gerasimov, said, they're not my Russians, they're troublemakers. Go at them if you want. And the DOD killed probably 200 Russians, but they were not real military forces. However, Putin uses these private armies to do all kinds of provocative, troublesome things. They're certainly active in the Ukraine. They're active in several places in Africa. And of course, in Syria, they've been quite active. So he's a mischievous person using all kinds of weapons, political intervention being one of them, with trying to influence our politics. He's very busy with that throughout Europe. It is creating a swing in Europe towards more nationalism. So he does a lot with a weak economy.
Yeah, this leads me to one final question. Is within the United States, beyond polarization, what is an underlooked political or macroeconomic trend that either the public nor the financial markets have caught on to yet?
Well, the biggest challenge is that wealth inequality, every time we try to fix a crisis, it gets bigger. And in the process, if you look at how the economy functions, it's more and more concentrated. I mean, we solve bank problems by having big banks absorb troubled banks, so they got bigger. And so there are 5 banks that dominate the entire economy. And eventually it'll be 2 or 3. It's a lot like the media. The media is more and more concentrated. Healthcare is becoming more concentrated. The only thing that holds it back is the prohibitions against crossing state lines. It's hard to find places where concentration and then concentration of wealth goes with it. The public eventually is not. It's not sustainable. sustainable. So behind the next crisis, we'll find a way to resolve it, but can we find a way to resolve it that doesn't make this inequality of opportunity and wealth even bigger? Because that simply is not sustainable in the long run. It's undermining the whole idea of a market economy, which is supposed to distribute the gains from growth to everybody. But right now, it's not happening. Now, the other part of challenge is that we have been, since the 2008 September crisis, when Lehman collapsed and the economy fell into a deep hole worldwide, since then, we have grown, we've recovered, it is said, but almost all of that has been driven by borrowing. It hasn't been investment in new productivity. And all of the gains from the tax cuts that Trump pushed through Congress have been used for stock buybacks and dividend increases. So it was good for shareholders, good for executives, but it did nothing for the economy. So if we have a downturn, which is inevitable somewhere in the next year or two, because we're coming to the end of a long cycle, we're going to find that we owe a lot of money, but have no new capacity to climb out. So that's going to be the really big challenge. And I don't think we're going to be able to print our way out of it with the Fed. So how to somehow wind back towards a more fair economy, that's going to be the challenge for coming leadership.
It sounds like the main political issue in the United States and China at the root is the same, which is how to...
I think it is exactly the same.
Yeah, how to unwind this debt that's built up over the long kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, the period of the global economy from about the end of the Cold War to today. And, with debt that's built up in both of these countries, we've been kicking the can about who's going to be the winners, who's going to be the losers when we reckon with this great stockpile of debt. And ultimately, that's a political decision. So it's going to require leadership. Yeah.
Well, we need a new kind of leader who isn't so consumed with their own elevation. I mean, we're driven by egomaniacs, basically.
Sometimes I think that there's that issue is so big and so goes to the very core of our society that no one's ever going to be able to address it until it's too late.
Yeah, maybe, but I just the country has gone through these kinds of problems before. We just haven't had it so centralized. But personalities, have long dominated various segments of the economy. But it's now become extreme. There must be among all the young people in America, there must be some people who can rise above this and say, look, I'm not here for me, I'm here for the necessary changes. I think it can be done. I spent a lot of time in working with Congress for many years, crossing party lines, sitting late at night with people on both sides, trying to figure out how to do things here and there that were productive. So it's not humans are capable of doing this. Now, this new wave we're going to get in this election coming up is going to be a wave of a lot more female candidates who don't have history with each other or with the present establishment. So you're going to get a lot of new faces, but it's going to be people coming out of professional careers, but a lot of them are going to be moms, and they're going to be thinking, how do we fix things for the young? I mean, I think there's just naturally going to be a wave of changing interests. So I'm a little bit hopeful that, actually very hopeful that is going to shift the focus away from the major issues that polarize us to, how do we improve education, fit the next generations to the challenges coming, redo everything. I was in Japan just 2 weeks ago in a meeting about the question of whether Japan should abolish the entire Department of Education for the whole country and introduce competition among regions to help teach creativity, innovation, seizing opportunities, because Japan has always been, in the school system, has always been guided by the idea that the nail that sticks out should be hammered down, that nobody should be troublemaker. But they've lost the ability to kind of thinking we're going to have to face it also. And the way we educate everybody now is not appropriate to all the opportunities that are arising with humans and artificial intelligence. That's going to open up the world in entirely new ways. So I have hopes for the future, but right now I'm pretty gloomy about the near term.
Hello, everybody. Sorry about the various audio quality problems for that interview, but I hope you really enjoyed it. We wanted to have a little addendum that followed the conversation just to cover all the different bases, and I wanted to put in my 2 cents and say that I was happy I was here to ask my one question, and it's totally fine that I didn't have to say a lot today because I really enjoyed Harold's really interesting stories, jokes, anecdotes, and I wish I could spend more time with him in person. Nick, Jack, what do you guys have to say?
Yeah, I thought it was a good interview, barring his connection issues that we had throughout the show. I thought it would be more questions, but he had really long explanations that covered a lot of interesting topics, such as the polarization of politics in the United States and the real catalyst for the Vietnam War, which actually dated back to pre-LBJ. And we talked about the whole Russian history and the politics behind the rivalry between the U.S. and Russia goes deeper than capitalism versus communism. And then what's going on currently with the trade war in China. It's a very interesting insight from a unique, nonpartisan perspective.
Yeah, I think that there's one kind of emerging thesis that's been coming up in multiple different shows we've been doing, which is that like long-term, like big-time macro market outcomes are like often actually decided by political questions. They're the outcomes of power struggles. And I thought it was very instructive how Harold was saying that, China's had debt-fueled economic expansion, and now someone's going to have to take a hit. And like the political struggle is all about who's going to take that hit, and that has a lot to do. That explains a lot of like what Xi Jinping has been doing. And I'm like, gee, that sure sounds familiar. That kind of is like the political question that everybody's been avoiding in the United States for the last 10 years. Anyway, it was a good interview.
And if you're a listener and you've liked the shows, like by number of downloads, both of the shows that we've had with Jack so far have been top 5. And if you like the show, we would love to hear your feedback on it. Tell us what you would like in the next show, what kind of guests and questions you would like to hear on these topics. And should we have geopolitics episode number 3, which we probably will, if with just Jack and Nick and I. You should go to reddit.com/nothingexempt and write a comment or reach out to us on Twitter at nothingexempt. And Nick, why don't you close us out?
Yeah, thank you for listening. Just another thing you should do is you should write reviews on iTunes. The more reviews we have written on iTunes, the higher we move up on the rankings and the more downloads, which means the bigger time guests. Like, you want us to see on people like the head of states or major hedge fund managers or other big power hitters in finance and economics and politics. The best way to help us get the big guests on is to increase the subscriber counts and the review counts on our iTunes page.
All right. Thanks for having me on again, guys.